Adam Creighton, thank you so much for your time. Did Japan's government panic, overreact to the Fukushima accident?
Yeah, look, I certainly think they did overreact. Of course, there was the tsunami in early 2011, and then within the space of 14 months, the Japanese government shut down, I think, about 40 nuclear power plants, which comprised effectively 30% of that economy's power supply. And, of course, the Japanese economy is the third largest, fourth largest in the world. It's probably the biggest transition in energy in world history, I would say, and it turned out to be a disaster for many Japanese who died in the cold because of the surge in power prices by about 40% in some cities.
So what's the moral here, do you think?
Well, the authors certainly said the moral was to, be a bit sceptical about the so-called precautionary principle, which basically says, and of course it's used all the time in relation to climate change, that we should take very extreme acts now at whatever cost to avoid some possibility in the future, which may eventuate. The academics from Columbia University in the US and also from the University of Nagoya in Japan, they concluded that you really have to take account of the consequences of those decisions in the here and now, and not just look at what might happen in the future, what might be improved, what might be averted. Of course, that's actually very rational, and indeed they also concluded that the decision to shut down all those power stations in Japan, quite aside from the 4,500 deaths, was based on emotion, really an instinct, rather than any sort of rational assessment of the pros and cons of energy.
That's frightening. We're looking specifically at that idea, this cost-benefit analysis that I've argued for some time should be applied to green policies, particularly when it comes to global warming. I just wonder whether fuel poverty, which is what we're talking about, is an issue that green campaigners should consider much more when calling for bans on nuclear power, but also coal-fired power, given that, in Britain, for instance, climate change charity E3G calculates more than 3,000 people a year in Britain are dying because they can't afford to heat their homes. And I've used before a Wollongong University survey of homes in parts of New South Wales said many were too cold in winter, dangerously cold, because owners were too scared to heat them. Fuel poverty, should that be taken more into account?
Yeah, look, I certainly think it should be. Of course, the irony here is that the Greens are a party of the left, at least supposedly, so you think that they would champion the welfare interests of poorer members of the community. But as you rightly point out, the increases in power prices certainly affect the poorest members of the community the most. And, for all the Greens' discussion and talk and, and prattling, I would say, about how low-cost renewables are, we've seen in this country extraordinary increase in power prices just at the same time we have an extraordinary increase in renewable energy. So, they really can't make the case that it is a cheaper form of energy. I mean, the fact is it's much more expensive. And just actually, might I add, from 2007 to 2011 in Japan, when of course it was largely nuclear, there were no price increases, actually just one price increase, whereas in Australia during that period, electricity prices went up 68%. So that just gives you extraordinary contrast of two systems, one that then was largely based on nuclear, and of course ours here that was increasingly based on renewable energy.
Well, I should also point out to the Green movement that were cheering the closing down of the nuclear power stations in Japan that to make up for the fall in generation, that the Japanese authorities relied much more on coal as well. So that wasn't too good for the global warming movement. New figures out today, just changing quickly, Adam, since I've got you here. New figures out today show that inflation stayed low for the September quarter, just 0.5%. That makes just 1.7% for the year. And what's more worrying, of course, is that that's mostly due to weak wages growth. Australians just aren't getting much richer, plus a slack job market. How worried should we be about all this?
Well, I think on balance the Reserve Bank would have been happy with the figures. It was a slight increase in the inflation rate from the previous quarter, from 1.6 over the year to 1.7% over the year. The probability of a rate cut next week on the Melbourne Cup Day actually fell in half from about 15% to 6% actually. So certainly investors thought that the modest uptick in inflation, still certainly well below the Reserve Bank's target, but modest uptick nevertheless, meant that it was less likely that there would be a fourth interest rate cut this year by the Reserve Bank. Of course, we've already had three. The official cash rate is 0.75, but I don't think we'll be seeing a 0.5 until sometime early next year.
And what about the government? Should it just sit and wait, hope for the best, see if its tax cuts finally do filter through in time for Christmas shopping, or is more needed?
Look, I think more is needed, but certainly not on the spending side. I think the government has a lot of scope to bring forward its 2024 tax cuts to next year. You know, why not start them from next year? I mean, can you think of a Western country that would actually announce tax cuts in 6 years' time? It's really bizarre that the bulk of those tax cuts are so far away when the economy is slowing now. And the fact is, if they brought them forward, based on the analysis of the Centre for Independent Studies at least, the government would still be in surplus. They'd be smaller surpluses, but they'd still be in surplus. So they could achieve the political holy grail of having a surplus, but also bring forward those incentive effects of lower marginal rates that will improve the economy longer term.
And also give people back their own money.
Exactly, yes, also that.
You make great sense. Thank you so much indeed for your time.